Welcome to the Voice of Counseling, presented by the American Counseling Association. This program is hosted by Dr. S. Kent Butler. This week's episode is Counseling Practice During Phases of a Pandemic Virus and features Dr. Mark Stebnicki.
Welcome to the Voice of Counseling from the American Counseling Association. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler, and joining us today is Dr. Mark A. Stebnicki. Counseling Practice During Phases of a Pandemic Virus is a new book that he has just put out, and we're going to discuss that today. Dr. Stebnicki is a professor emeritus and former coordinator of the Military and Trauma Counseling Certificate Program at East Carolina University. He developed the MTC certificate in 2015 and the Clinical Military Counseling Certificate Program in 2016, which is offered through the Telehealth Certificate Institute. Dr. Stebnicki is an active practitioner, researcher, counselor educator, trainer for over 35 years. So that's some great experience that's going to be coming to us to share with us what he's been doing, the work that he's been doing within the psychosocial rehabilitation and mental health needs for adolescents and adults with trauma, chronic illness, and disabilities. So joining us today, Dr. Stebnicki. How are you doing today, Mark?
Hey, man. Thanks, Ken, for having me. And I really appreciate American Counseling Association, offering me to come on your show. I mean, this is the pinnacle of my career, seriously.
You've been doing some phenomenal work for 35 years, so why wouldn't we want to have you here?
Well, I'm only as good as my last presentation. That's about it.
So okay, well, we're going to make this one a great one. So can you tell me a little bit about what motivated you to write this book, especially this time of the year, especially with this pandemic that we've been going through?
Yeah. Well, you gave my background there. So over 30 years, 35 years working with chronic illness, disability, and in the last 20 years, I specifically work with veterans, active duty service members, veterans with disabilities, military families. Kent, I've lived and worked in communities that were plagued by violence, by gun violence, workplace violence, and those are person-made disasters. And then, natural disasters such as earthquakes, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes. I had a colleague tell me once that, boy, I don't want to move to the town you're going to next.
I was thinking that it was following you around a little bit there. But I think one of the great things that happens when these types of things happen is it helps to trying to create who you become as a person and as a practitioner, right? So you were able to adapt to those things very easily.
Yeah, and in March 1998, I was a member of the crisis response team for the West Side Middle School shootings in Jonesboro, Arkansas.
Okay.
And it was an 11 and 13-year-old shooter that killed 4 students, a teacher, and injured over 20 others. So I guess you can say 1998 began I was working at Arkansas State University Department of Counseling and Psychology at the time. So, I was just a natural go-to person to go out and do critical incident stress debriefing. So, the point being is that, these kind of life experiences, if you're resilient, bring some meaning, and you find out others that could benefit from training like this. So, counseling practice during phases of pandemic virus is my 10th work. I think number 8 was a disaster mental health response. And so, I just have a body of research, a body of practice. So, what I did is I put the old disaster mental health hymnal on my bookshelf. And then I wrote a new anthem describing the medical, physical, mental health characteristics of this new disease that we have. And this is, COVID-19, the viral pandemic that never sleeps. It's relentless, never takes a day off.
Right.
So, the counseling profession as a whole, I feel, needs to prepare for, prevent, and treat disaster mental health because it looks differently than natural or person-made disasters.
Can you tell me a little bit about your writing style? How did you get there? I mean, what made you, your 10th work? So as a practitioner who's writing and sharing this work with so many people out there who are doing the work in the field, what got you there, and what's your joy and your love in terms of writing?
Good question. So, I had some really good mentors in my doc program for writing. And then Jerry Corey, Dr. Corey's been a mentor to me. He's,
Okay.
in terms of inviting me on the book panels that he does at the annual conference.
Uh-huh.
And after years of writing, you get to look at. I have a voice also, so here's what I'd like to say. You get a certain breadth of knowledge in a specific topic area, and then you take that and put it in your own voice. You can develop conceptual models, theoretical models that may be interesting for researchers somewhere down the road. So, it takes a while finding your voice. Textbooks don't give you that latitude, I think. Some of the books, guidelines, clinical military counseling that I did with ACA last year, and then this year, counseling practice during pandemic, of course, it's, research based. I've got a panel of 8 experts that have looked at my pandemic risk and resiliency model. So
Good.
this is research based, but, I wanted to use my own voice. So
Right.
my style of writing comes along with, I think, practice and experience. I've had some mentors, probably like you, that are pure researchers, and they're good. It's good mentors to have, but you also need to learn how to develop your own characteristics.
Yeah, and I think that's great. I mean, when you are able to kind of tap into who you are as a person and give from that perspective, because that's who we are as counselors in the long run, is what we give of ourselves. And so why not use our own natural ability to kind of make that happen? Speaking of natural abilities and all those other things, so there's a multitude of natural and person-made disasters that are out there, right? How do we kind of reconceptualize disaster response, especially as it relates to a viral pandemic?
Sure. So, before you even start with a viral pandemic, you got to have some awareness, knowledge, and skills of how to work with the unique attributes of a natural disaster, person-made disaster, biological disaster, and so forth here. So, once you begin to recognize the unique, medical, physical, psychological, social, emotional aspects of disaster, then what you try to do is, look at, first of all, the literature on other pandemic viruses here. And, we in the US haven't had that many pandemics. We've been lucky. We've got Zika virus. Of course, HIV started with an endemic, or started as a epidemic, then went to a pandemic. So, we have a number of examples, but, I think some of the differences is, pandemics are an ongoing disaster. There's no beginning, there's no middle, there's no end. So as we transition through that, I think what this book does is it talks about a model I developed, the adaptation and adjustment model. So it assists practitioners with identification, early intervention, triage, prevention, and preparation. So, that's a maybe popular phase, but what I did is I plugged in natural elements of a pandemic virus, which is unrelenting. It never ends here. So what I look at is untreated, undertreated, unrecognized signs that's unique to this disaster. For instance, if you live in a small town and your job falls through, or factory shuts down, or coal mining dries up, and you're dealing with one geographic location. But with a pandemic, you're dealing with job loss all over the US. So that's what's unique about, I think, understanding the multitude of natural and person-made disasters, is also understanding the unique aspects of pandemic viruses here. So, we're fighting an unseen enemy. If you live in a hurricane-prone area, tornadoes, you've got physical evidence of the disaster, right. Whereas pandemics, you can't see it unless you work in a laboratory. where you can look
Let
at
me
the
ask you
virus
a
under a
question really
microscope.
quickly based on
Sure.
that. Like I just today I just was thinking I heard about someone who passed away, someone out in California who was unvaccinated, and so that's the new thing now. So we've been going through this, and it's been adapting, and it's been changing, and we came into this not knowing, right? I mean, I didn't know anything about what a pandemic would do like this, and what it would actually kind of
Most counselors don't
curtail
know that.
into as it continued to evolve. So now we have this virus who has all these variants that are coming out. Didn't know about that. How do we learn about that? What do we need to know about the fact that, like you just said, it's never ending? So are we to be kind of getting ourselves prepared for the fact that this is going to be another variant after another variant after another variant? How do we come to grips with this?
So, humankind has known viruses for centuries. So it's just part of being human and living
Okay.
on Earth. And so, viruses, job in nature is to morph into something else where they can live on a host. Either it's an animal host,
Okay.
could jump to a human host.
Okay.
So, one thing that I emphasize in the book is that there's no beginning, middle, and end to viruses because they morph into other kind of diseases. So,
Okay.
I'm not sure if I'm answering your question. As we move along, you might understand.
Yeah, I think you are in a sense, because it just was not. It's just that we got into this and like, oh, it's going to be a year. Oh, it's going to be, it'll be past us in 2 years, and then we learn more and more and more. And now you saying that it's never ending, that brings a whole nother context to it. And I think you brought some reality to me by saying things like HIV and AIDS and Ebola and other things that have come along that we see now are continuous. Like it's
Yes.
almost like the flu that we had. We continually take the vaccine so that people don't get the flu every year and things
Sure.
along those lines. So it kind of
And
makes sense.
cultures learn how to survive and adapt. And I really emphasize in that my book about adjustment to, I use stage models of adjustment to chronic illness and disability as an example to build into this pandemic adjustment. Is that there's predictable stages that the literature and the research has shown. There's a lot of fear, anxiety, mood disorders, irrational behaviors that lead to harm to self and others.
Right.
And so we're sort of in a war-torn area here where we're fighting this unseen enemy here on the COVID battlefield. So, cultures learn how to adapt. If you live on an archipelago, you worry about flooding,
Yeah.
food insecurity, tornadoes, hurricanes. Well, not tornadoes, but hurricanes. If you're immigrant, refugee, asylum seeker, you're worried about survival. So, different cultures throughout history have learned how to survive and thrive at the same time. I think that's what we have to learn. So, it's hard to say where we're at in that cycle because I'm not an epidemiologist, but, what I do hear is that new variants come out that, we got to have some hope from a psychological point of view because a vaccination was developed. Okay. So there will be an end to, at some point, to the spread, the contagion itself.
The level it is right now.
Viral load.
Okay.
But, from a psychological point of view, I talk about historical trauma. You think about,
Yes.
every trauma that comes along and
Yeah.
it doesn't get recognized. So it becomes untreated, undertreated, or unrecognized. And you just you try to move on and try to get back to balance. But, Kent, we're all having a normal response to an abnormal event.
Okay.
It's helpful to remember that, I think.
That's good to know. So we know that there are multiple medical, physical, and mental health conditions associated with disasters, right? So what are some of the differences that we see in the COVID disaster versus other disasters?
Sure. So, other disasters, as I mentioned, are very visible. Other natural disasters are pretty visible. I mean, you're looking at, hurricanes, floods, tornadoes. But for COVID, you think about all the deaths. There's, what is there, over 700,000, 825,000. I got the figure somewhere, but there's significant amount of deaths that have surpassed Spanish flu deaths. Spanish flu in the US killed about 675,000. COVID's casualty is much higher than that. So, there's multiple medical, physical conditions that are untreated, undertreated, unrecognized. The rebuilding process could take years because that, when you think about the systems in the US, our healthcare system, our financial markets, manufacturing industry, for producing goods and services, our social political system is under strain. So every conceivable aspect of life on the globe and in our own little world has had to stand up to this viral contagion. And then you think you're safe, and then it morphs into a mutant variant. So, here's the thing, Kent, is that virologists, epidemiologists understand this stuff. They know where it's going. They love exploring this. In counseling and psychology, though, this is unexplored territory. I mean, we're just starting to see journal articles come out about, the psychological impact. Here's the thing that we're at a crossroads with here, is that we have a disease of unknown etiology here. We still don't know how COVID happened, except it can be explained by scientists as that it wasn't developed in a laboratory. It's a naturally occurring coronavirus, and there's like 12,000 coronaviruses that have been identified. So luckily, most of them haven't been as lethal as COVID-19 in some of its mutant variants here.
And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people didn't really take into consideration. It took a while for people to kind of realize that, yes, this is the 19th iteration of this.
And that's a natural part of trying to adjust and adapt to any kind of disaster, whether it's natural disaster, person-made disaster. We want things to get back to normal. Yeah. I mean, we pray hard for the soul wounding, this trauma to end for some people, because here you have a disease of unknown etiology. It creates fear and panic. When's the next variant going to come up? How lethal is that? We do know that one of the most frequent symptoms in pandemics is fear and anxiety, because you can't predict. But what we can do is look at disease and how psychosocial adjustment to, say, cancer is, to other life-threatening illnesses. And we can predict, we can anticipate what some of those sticking points are going to be, red flags. So as therapists, it's important to understand this new psychosocial adjustment to a pandemic virus here, because we can be prepared for it. And I just want to add one thing, is that, 5 years ago, I think we put together a panel of experts in the US. It contained the CDC, the NSA, the DOD, and some other top experts. And, the president wanted to determine what the next threat would be to American national security.
Right.
So what do you think number one was? Of course, terrorism, right? Homeland threats and all that. You know what was way at the bottom of the list? A lethal virus, a deadly virus. And, folks back then, the course of scientists were saying, hey, we got to put money into this. We got to prepare. And, the other people in the task force are like, hey, we don't have anything that's threatening right now. We're worried about Al-Qaeda or ISIL, So anyway, the point being is that, there's multiple medical, physical, mental health conditions associated with disaster. Pandemics are unique because they're ongoing. What we do know is that there's this adjustment that happens during any natural or person-made disaster. But the problem with the pandemic is that it's pervasive. It never sleeps.
It never sleeps.
And it's always around us here. So, we need to be looking at ways how to bounce back.
ties into people's anxiety
Yeah.
because, especially for us as counselors. So you talk about um, phases, phases of a pandemic. And can you kind of talk about what you're talking about there? What are you referring to when you say phases? And should we be really referring to what's happening now as a disaster?
Oh, it's definitely a disaster. And,
Okay.
when you look at the death, the mortality, the sickness, and the unique losses, the loss of job, loss of childcare, schools shutting down, parents have to leave their job to take care of sick family members. And so, yeah, it's a disaster. So what's new, again, is that psychology and counseling quite doesn't understand this, but public health, traditional public health epidemiologists know, that's their field of specialty. They study, pandemics, epidemics. So, viruses and diseases are natural occurring events that turn into natural disasters, like I mentioned before. So, all have potential to be public health crisis. But when you look at disease like rabies, vaccine was developed by Louis Pasteur back in 1885. Rabies still exists today. Tetanus vaccine developed in 1927. The shot's still available to reduce infection. Mumps, measles, rubella, it's a disease with no cure. Shots were widely distributed around 1971. Hepatitis A and B, the H1N1 flu. So these all have no cures, disease of no cures. We know what the etiology is, but we don't have a cure for it. So, but we do have mitigation measures to stop the infectious spread. We got vaccines developed for that. So, yes, COVID-19 is a disaster. It is because it's a viral contagion. And epidemiologists look at this as it's an endemic, at best case scenario, COVID-19 will be an endemic disease where we got vaccines now, and then boosters maybe on a regular basis, possibly. So,
Mark, that makes me think
yeah,
really
go ahead.
quickly. It makes me think about the fact that there are people who, don't want to take the vaccine, but people over time have adapted to taking vaccines. You named off of quite a few different things just now. What is it about the human psyche that causes people to not trust? Especially when we're going through something as devastating as what's happening right now.
Sure. So I think we all have opinions on it, but I think we need to look at this holistically here. I mean, we're in unprecedented times in terms of our political environment. Vaccines, good virus hygiene has become a major political issue. And, this has never happened before. So things are changing politically and that affect public health. And so when I grew up, my parents wanted to get me a polio shot. They didn't want to say, yeah, let's, we're gonna not give her son a shot, because whatever reason, So, parents back then, wanted to get their kids vaccinated for all kinds of, mumps, rubella, you name it, all these diseases here. If you go to
There's
work
a trust. There was also a trust in the medical system for many people.
That's true. And so we look at that piece of it, and we did trust the healthcare system, medical system. Nobody questioned it here. So, in my opinion, one of the driving forces is the distrust of the medical system. So we can call that, personal distrust, religious distrust, whatever it is here. But, if you review some of the models in the books here, it talks about guidelines for phases to try to treat this soon to be hopefully endemic disease as opposed to pandemic disease here. I didn't title the book Phases of COVID-19 Virus on purpose. I titled it, Phases of a Pandemic Virus, because it's not specific to COVID-19. And so, for the, pandemics have occurred for centuries, as I mentioned before, throughout human history. But I think now we're just being able to understand the medical, physical, psychological aspects but counseling and psychology is behind. So they need, I think, some models, some prompting, some other additional research. Whereas public health students and epidemiology, they're at the epicenter of this disaster. Think about having a kid in a master's degree program in public health,
Right.
how much motivation there is to go into the field. And so, but it same should be with mental health professionals and all counseling professionals. Now's the time to make your decision to get into the field.
So let me ask you a question for students and people who are coming up behind you, who see you as a role model in terms of the writing and the things that you are doing, the books that you have put forward. You've been building up to this over time, and so when did you start writing this book, and how long did it take you to finish it? It's just a curious question I have.
Well, I started writing it in my head around 1998, as I mentioned before, with Crisis Come Opportunities, being on the crisis response team for West Side Middle School shooting. Then I moved to Greenville to work at ECU in 1999, and there was Hurricane Floyd. So, that was at the time the state's largest disaster. So, I started writing this book when it started impacting my life, and then some of my own childhood experiences too. This session's not about me, but we all are driven to the field for multiple reasons. So, I think I had this book within me, and the seeds were planted with various experiences. And that may be important for people to understand if you're attuned. And you can take a look at what motivates you to, join a health club for the year 2022. What motivates you to go on a diet, to have better thoughts, and so once you plant those seeds, you think about stages of motivation, pre-contemplation, contemplation, and so forth. Here, same with writing. Is that you think about doing something and trying to improve the world, but at the same time, it improves me too.
Wow. So that's really good to know. It's fascinating to hear you say that you started looking at this in 1998, because many people, because of the times, would say, oh, March of 2020, I'd sat down and decided I would just crank this book out and have it done by August of 2020 or something like that. You know what I mean? So that's good to hear your process in doing that, because I think that's what young writers need to understand too, who want to.
And then you got to have a vision, I think.
Yeah.
So, a vision is critical, because, look at the Wright brothers. They were, people thought they're crazy. They wanted to fly. They were bike mechanics, basically. They built bikes in Dayton, Ohio.
Right.
And so they go to the Outer Banks of North Carolina. They failed many times, crashing. You don't hear about the plane crashes the failed experiments. You just hear about the first in flight. Martin Luther King's another example. He had a vision, a dream about civil rights, and we still have to maintain that vision, and despite all the carnage around us, the damage. So, having a vision. If you're a student, if you're a young writer, having some vision is a good first place to begin, to plant the seeds of, how can my unique voice be heard?
Nice. Thank you for sharing that. It just popped up just now when you were saying that, and I was just like, wow, when did this whole thing come about? So we're coming up on a break time here, and so I want to give you an opportunity, just really one last question before we go to break. We hear people say a lot, we're all in this together, right? You hear it all the time, right? And so there are issues that are related to vulnerable populations, health disparities, and other social cultural factors that overlap, all those types of things that come into effect. So what is unique here while we're here in the midst of this pandemic?
Well, I don't mean to crush your spirit here, but we're not all in this together here, Kent. That statement implies that we all enjoy the same benefits, the same privileges, We're all the same socioeconomic status. We have access to good quality healthcare, jobs, civil rights, adequate support systems. So, many Americans don't recognize the seriousness of this lethal virus here. So, I'd like to offer a reframe is that we are all our own best support system. Okay. I think it's, as we come together in this present moment, I think we can unite as communities in our region. And that's hard to do. You see the rise of white nationalism, racism, actions to overthrow the government. Then thrown on top of that, you have a pandemic viruses making people sick and so forth. So, we're not all in this together, but, we're all our own best support system here. I think that would be a good place to leave.
Yeah, we can break it there and come back to kind of touch base on some of that again. Well, thank you, Mark. Again, this is the Voice of Counseling. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler, and we're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back in a few minutes.
Counselors help positively impact lives by providing support, wellness, treatment. We're working to change lives. We are creating a world where every person has access to the quality, professional counseling, and mental health services needed to thrive.
Welcome back to the Voice of Counseling. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler, and we're here today with Dr. Mark Stebnicki. And we're going to just get into another part of his massive repertoire here. And so can you tell me a little bit about the veteran and military communities and how they've been impacted by this pandemic?
Sure. So, as you mentioned in the introduction, and as I mentioned also, I've worked with active duty service members, veterans with disabilities, military family members. I look at them as a vulnerable population, especially service members that are transitioning and reintegrating into civilian life.
Right.
So, military, they live together, they train up together, they deploy together, So they're a vulnerable population because they can't socially isolate. It's critical that we have military members here. So, since the beginning of COVID-19, the reporting period up to December 2021, last month, the DoD reported somewhere around 390,000 service members, family members, and civilian DoD contractors contracted COVID. And, believe it or not, there are COVID deaths. In fact, there are about 632 casualties as a direct result of COVID here. The interesting thing is that 97% of active duty personnel have been vaccinated against COVID. So, that's decent. But when we think about the military as an occupation, it's a high-risk occupation anyway for medical, physical, and psychological injury. And then living in close quarters to one another, especially for those of you listening that have been in the Navy, being on a Carnival cruise, battleship, there's all kinds of flus that run through the ship here. So, life and safety of others are dependent upon your quick and decisive actions as military service personnel. So some of the principles that the military uses in their advanced training for leadership is risk management. They're looking at, assessing hazards, trying to maintain an operation tempo to mitigate risk. And we're talking about, engaging enemy combatants. So an endemic or pandemic is pretty new for the military even. So, the pandemic is a national security threat. It is a natural disaster. And without good performance measures and being able to have a strong, resilient fighting force of men and women, then we're at risk, I think, as a nation. So, the military is very invested in trying to mitigate spread and contagious viruses such as COVID-19.
How can counselors be supportive of military and we thank them for their service, but how can we, especially those who may not necessarily gravitate towards us, how can we kind of be impactful there?
Well, first understanding the military is a culture unto itself. I
Right.
mean, you think about the demands of having to kill. The military brain is mapped differently. It's aggress, not stress. In civilian life, if a gun is pointed towards you, you're running away from gunfire. Military runs towards gunfire. So understanding the cultural aspects of the military, how the brain is wired, how it's such a unique occupation, and then maybe cutting through some of the military myths, stereotypes that we have. We think everyone's
like the concept of almost like the first responder too, right? You're running to this, you're going to the danger.
Yeah. So, as professionals, we need to be able to establish a rapport before we get to a working alliance with that military client. And then understanding that, it's critical to establish and earn the circle of trust, whether you're earning the circle of trust with, a firefighter or a cook or a warfighter in the military. That's critical aspect. And that, it's also helpful to understand today's military in the 21st century is different than your mother's or father's military. Generally the stereotype of the military is it's a bunch of, white, hyper masculine males. But, there's 40% of the military now that makes up people of color, different racial ethnic groups, women. Women represent a higher percentage than any other time in history. There's like 18% of women in the military. So, understanding the within cultural group differences is critical for establishing this rapport, earning the circle of trust with military clients, and the unique occupational attributes. And they're at higher risk for a lot of medical, physical, psychological injury while in service, but as they transition out, there's long-term disability that can occur as a result of their service.
Do you think there's differentiation between the military branches as well?
Good point. There's people turn their head when I say 6 branches of the military. There used to be 5 branches. Now we got Space Force, right? So we got Army, Navy, Marines, Air Force, Coast Guard. Coast Guard, since post 9/11, is now part of under the DoD, the branch of the military. Now Space Force. So there are within group differences. We got ground forces, the Marines, the Army. So we tend to. So knowing the language a little bit, we call it fighting ground forces or combat zones, combat theater. In the Navy, they'd call that combat space, or the Air Force. There's just little nuances like that in terms of rituals, in terms of language, in terms of traditions, between the Marines and, the media tends to call everyone in the military a soldier. Well, the soldier is related to the Army. Don't ever call a Marine a soldier. They might get upset.
Happen. I don't know.
What's that?
I said, what would happen? I don't know.
What would happen? Well, if you're in a therapeutic situation, all the service members I've had are very polite. That I haven't done that, but they wouldn't tell you that necessarily in a therapeutic situation. But it would certainly hinder rapport building if had if we made some assumptions about a certain branch of the military, or
So do your homework is what you're saying. Understand the different branches.
Take classes, take seminars regarding the military as a culture, and understanding the unique aspects of the military as an occupation, and then some of the unique mental, physical, medical conditions that they have.
So speaking of that, with the military involved as well, are there unique mental health conditions that counselors are seeing right now during this pandemic?
Yeah, so, as I mentioned in part 1 of our conversation, is that the research shows that fear, anxiety, are the predominant features found in other countries in terms of pandemics and epidemics here. because you don't know when the next wave of infection is coming. So you can imagine that's one of the most common fears here. So in today's practice, though, some of the more clinically significant symptoms are major depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, substance use disorder, and then there's some level of suicidality. I mean, think about losing everything, not only your health, but your job and some of the other aspects. There's unique losses that are associated with the pandemic versus other types of natural disasters here. So, Kent, as I mentioned before, we're all having a normal response to an abnormal event. So some of the unique mental health conditions are first understanding that we're having normal reactions, but we have to, as therapists, we have to understand the unique losses to family, friends, illnesses, jobs, career opportunities, educational opportunities, and then be able to determine what's healthy, normal behavior and what's unhealthy, abnormal behavior. So the book goes over that in detail, the pandemic risk and resiliency continuum that I talked about.
So does it talk a little bit about the ripple effect of it all? Because, as I'm listening to you talk right now, yes, there's all these different things that are happening because of our mental health conditions and things along those lines. But I started to recognize that it impacts. So it impacts you physically, it impacts your job, it impacts, we think about it, nobody thought that we would go back to school or not go to school or have to be remote and things along those lines. So there's an impact that goes way beyond just what somebody might be feeling because of the pandemic.
Yeah. So, being that it's a pandemic, it affects everyone around you. It's not a geographic specific natural disaster like a flood, hurricane, tornado, or wildfire. So that's the thing that permeates our consciousness is you hear it in the news media, you talk to neighbors, you go to church and, you see people wearing masks or you have online church. So, it's just being permeated. It's a pervasive, chronic, and persistent, not only disease, but it permeates our mental health consciousness also.
Yeah. Do you see folks dealing with loss and grief differently now?
Loss and grief is kind of a complex topic to talk about. It's multidimensional. And the reason being is that we all have our own level of resiliency and coping with losses and grief. Some people are pretty stoic when they go to a funeral. They don't release emotion at all. Other, cultures have parades.
Yeah.
They celebrate the loss and all that. So, we sort of have to look at loss and grief individually. So this is the unique position that we're in as counselors, is that we do have to look, at the own unique attributes of that individual. You can't make assumptions. So, but there's a loss of ability to connect socially, I think, which is difficult for people, particularly those that like to get out and have fun, do recreational activities. So that's a major loss for them. Then there's financial loss, job loss. Just today I saw on the news that Chicago Public Schools shut down again. They're going to go back to online education. So, as we were talking about this before, Kent, there's this wave and phases. So we're not at the end. We're not at the middle. We have to ride this wave.
It's an unknown wave, right?
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, the unknown wave.
Wow. Yeah. So you mentioned that we need to reconceptualize disaster response, that counselors, they know or how to kind of really deal with the pandemic virus to change the ways in which kind of we facilitate therapeutic interactions with each other. So whether it's in the mental health field, in the schools, career counseling, all those different things. So how do we reconceptualize?
Well, I think one way of understanding is that wars, famine, infectious diseases have been around us for since ancient times and biblical times. So, the leading cause of death is disease and disability in developing countries. So, think about undeveloped countries that don't have the medicine and the healthcare system and the public healthcare system, that their trauma is probably more significant than in the US here. So, I think it's helpful to understand, Kent, this combination of this traumatic soul wounding that doesn't have a beginning, middle, and end. And that, these mutant variants can infect us at any time here. But you can't just be writing your life on that wave, because you know where that is. That goes to helplessness and despair and depression. So, I think I mentioned this before, that cultures learn how to adapt and survive and thrive. And I think that's what's important about the counseling field, is understanding the unique attributes of what a pandemic disease is, that it's not a cancer, it's not heart disease, it's not a stroke, and it's a unique type of natural disaster. So we can use some of the same counseling theories and approaches, but we have to look at that through the pandemic lens.
Yeah.
And I think the book does a good job of indicating that,
Right.
How to couch that in terms of the unique attributes, the mental, physical, medical problems of. And
How
then
does the book kind of tie into helping counselors help clients understand COVID and vaccines medically? What have you been adding to that part of your text that helps folks work with those different vulnerable populations?
Sure. So, I propose this adaptation adjustment model. And what it does, it helps practitioners to identify, do early intervention, do triage, do prevention and preparation for pandemic viruses here. So it follows a lot of the same psychosocial adjustment models to chronic illness and disability, but this AA model, I call it, starts with first wave of pandemic of virus, what you can expect. In the first wave, if you can think back, 2020, say January, February 2020, nobody was really, tuned in on a pandemic. My gosh, we were still in our lives, do what we normally do. So, that's typical first wave, is you might hear something and it doesn't affect my world. So, so then in this adjustment model, then you look at the initial impact, and all of a sudden you start hearing in the media all these deaths related to COVID. So, there's the fear, anxiety. Some people respond with denial. Some people respond with depression or anger and hostility. And that, my factory might shut down, so there's anger. Or, I might have to keep my kid at home from school. Who's going to watch him? So there's that phase. There's the acknowledgement of a pandemic. And in the acknowledgement stage, it's saying that, okay, this is what I got to deal with now. So, you make adjustments to either survive or thrive. You make those choices here. So, basically, what this book does in helping counselors, it gives them a better understanding of various phases of the pandemic, how to anticipate and plan for different therapeutic interventions. In a lot of ways, this normalizes, what a pandemic is about, because, we're all going through a normal response to an abnormal event. We will survive this, we will adapt, we will adjust. And, as counselors, we have to motivate our clients to do that.
That's very encouraging. And I mean, it's especially given your background and knowing how these things have kind of evolved over time. We're coming up on the end of our time together. And I wanted to kind of put it back to see if there's anything that you wanted to add or share that you think that our counselors need to know. Like, what are your hopes that we are going to be moving forward towards? And I guess I'll ask it in this last question. How has COVID kind of changed or impacted the broader counseling profession from your perspective, and what do we need to be able to do to move forward as we kind of tie it up today?
Yeah, well, of course, there's a lot of offices that are shut down because of COVID. So we've learned how to use tele-behavioral health technology or telemental health.
Yes.
And, the medical profession has used this in rural health for probably the last 20 years. Okay. So, but counselors, this is new technology to counselors. So, there's classes you can take on how to, establish rapport, form therapeutic relationships, and do therapy through telebehavioral health. So, then there's new, everybody's adapting. The insurance companies, they got new CPT codes for telebehavioral health. So it does start this domino effect of how we have to adjust here. New clients have emerged. I've read several articles that say that there's a significant amount of people who've never been seen for psychotherapy before, and they're in therapy, okay? And they're taking anxiolytics or antidepressants. So, that's telling me that, wow, we're acquiring new populations of individuals that's never been to therapy. So, that's a opportunity to help a wider range of individuals here.
Yeah.
Then the pandemic's, created unemployment. There's temporary loss or there's permanent loss of jobs. So we got people going through career transition. People that were bartenders, cooks, servers, they've had to morph their career into something different because they'll never return back to something that's going to place their life at risk. And plus maybe they didn't like that job to begin with. They realized that it might be helpful to go back to college. And so we, career counselors have their work cut out for them in terms of job exploration, job development. And then
some serious soul searching for many of us.
Exactly.
With regards to that.
And then, children and adolescents, when they're having to be relegated to academic performance standards at home,
Yes.
The school age kids that have poor nutritional habits or food insecurity, because of their stay-at-home kids. So, we have new, we got a lot of work to do, a lot of new populations that we can be thankful about and to try to help. So, we have to consider the long-term impact of these collective trauma experiences of a pandemic and, try to understand how these unique extraordinary stressful and traumatic events impact vulnerable populations, just the regular populations that seek mental health services and so forth. So,
well, Mark, you really opened my eyes to a lot of different things, especially with regards to the military. And I thank you for coming in and talk with us today. It's been a phenomenal opportunity to kind of hear from your perspective, especially your writing process. So I want to thank you for being a guest today.
Thank you, Kent. I really appreciate you having me, and I appreciate ACA inviting me also.
It was a wonderful opportunity to get to know you better. So thank you so much. This is The Voice of Counseling. I'm Dr. S. Kent Butler. We were here today with Dr. Mark Stebnicki, and we had a great time talking about what we're going to be doing to get through this pandemic. So we'll see you next time.